I never imagined that the greatest silence of my life would come from the very person I loved most. I worked, saved every penny, sacrificed my dreams, all to see my son happy. But what did I get in return? Ingratitude. The wedding I'd planned with so much effort was just the beginning of a distance that grew until I became a stranger in his life. And just when I thought nothing could hurt more, I discovered that silence speaks louder than any words. I never thought a piece of paper could make so much noise inside our heads. The bill for the buffet, the DJ, the flowers, all added up to those US $21.000 cold, lined up like soldiers on a bank statement. I woke up to the house smelling of hairspray and church candles, the dress still hanging on the closet door, heavy with perfume and memories. My feet, poor things, throbbed as if they were still dancing a bolero that no one asked for an encore. I ran my hand over the table, and the wood felt cold, hard, like reality when it decides to knock on the door unceremoniously. I took a deep breath. It was worth it, I said, trying to convince myself first. The kitchen sounded like a late night, the refrigerator rumbling, the clock ticking slowly, the coffee maker spitting out sighs. That house had seen so many impromptu parties with stale bread and warm smiles that, for a second, I almost forgot the price of everything. I remembered the boy he'd been, the soap bubbles on the porch, the fever I'd brought down with a wet cloth and a whispered prayer. For him, I'll do it, I'd said in the past, and yesterday I did. But today my hand trembled differently, not from exhaustion but from warning. How do we know when love has gone too far? My phone blinked like a cat's eye in the dark. That impatient little light, poking at memories I'd rather leave alone. I opened the message with my heart in knots. No, thank you. No, we're home. Just, Mom. We need to talk. It's important. Important, I thought, that treacherous word, as useful as a hug as it is a demand. I rested my glasses on the tip of my nose and reread, as if searching for the screaming lines. The silence of absent gratitude spoke louder than any 2-minute audio. I placed the coffee cup against my lip and felt the bitter taste cross my tongue, descending my memory. I remembered the dress I hadn't bought, the heels I'd patched with duct tape, the nail polish I'd saved until it became a ghost on my fingernail. Every little "no" I'd said to myself turned into twinkling lights on the ceiling of the salon last night. I bought laughter, I bought photography, I bought the promise of a future. Or was I just renting it? The question lingered, like a mosquito in a stagnant summer. The church yesterday smelled of cloves and eternity. When he walked in with me, arm in arm, I felt the weight of life lift from the floor. I heard the choir, saw the beautiful bride, photographed every happy wrinkle on my face in the bathroom mirror. During the toast, I almost mentioned that popcorn cart he wanted when he was 8, and I said, "We'll buy it when we get back," and we never did. Yesterday, I returned. I returned with interest of longing, and I paid. When the lights in the ballroom dimmed, I thought I'd had enough. I felt a gentle rest, the kind you feel when you lie down on the mattress and your body is grateful. But the rest turned into a wake-up call when the music ended and no one looked at me. Am I exaggerating? Do mothers notice too much? Yes, we do. Because it was during the little one's repair that I learned how to sew a big one. And yesterday I saw a loose thread in a glued-on smile. The early morning was spent sorting memories into an imaginary drawer. The invitation I'd saved, the bouquet ribbon I'd hidden in my purse, the memory of his steps trying to keep up with his father in the living room, 2 left feet at a family party. I laughed to myself, a short laugh, almost a sneeze. Soon after, the pang came. The one you feel when you realize you've entered a dark room thinking it was a garden. Why does it hurt so much when the simple word is missing? I leaned my forehead against the window and watched the building in front sleep. A car drove by slowly, a dog barked in the distance, and I wondered when mother and son started exchanging notes for protocols. Messages that look like receipts, answers that look like passwords. At what point did the lap become an ATM? I don't like these questions. They knock and don't ask permission. But I've learned that ignoring a hammer only makes the noise worse. I grabbed the florist's stationery and, with my failing pen, wrote, "It was worth it, yes." I wrote like someone praying, repeating it to see if it would sink in. My heart wanted to believe that love doesn't send a bill, that a paid party is also a blessing. And it is. But blessings have a name, and that name is recognition. A loving mom. You were beautiful. It wouldn't be the same without you. Did I ask for too little? Did I ask for too late? Or did I ask for the basics? Daylight pushed the shadows beneath the closet. The coffee maker fell silent. The clock persisted. I closed my eyes and heard, deep within me, the unspoken phrase, "Thank you, Mom." 2 words that cost nothing and are worth everything. Maybe he'll say it later, I thought, trying to give fate a break. Maybe. Or maybe the important message has another face, another price, another wound with a label. I sighed, adjusted the dress on the hanger, and sat down to wait for what would come. Because something would come. It always does. I always say that my money was never made of bills, but of little pieces of me. Every real I saved came with a sacrifice, a no, whispered in the mirror. The blouse I didn't buy, the movie I turned down, the piece of cake I baked myself instead of ordering from the bakery. It was a collection of sacrifices I kept piling up inside an invisible piggy bank. All with one purpose. When my son got married, I wanted to throw him the party I never had. I remember well the first extra shift I took at the hospital. My colleagues looked at me with pity, thinking I was killing myself working for nothing. But I smiled because I knew what I was building, a future for him. With each sleepless night, I repeated like a mantra, one day, this will become the lights of a ballroom, it will become music, it will become a good memory. And that's how the sweat turned into a dream. My poor blender had to be repaired 3 times. The rubber was already more patched than my own hands. Still, I refused to buy another one. Each repair was a reminder. Don't waste it now, save it for later. I talked to myself, chatting with the appliances like someone talking to accomplices. And they, silent, obeyed, holding on a little longer, just like me. The overdue electricity bills, how many times I split them in 2, just so I wouldn't touch what I'd set aside for the wedding. I felt bad, of course, but at the same time I was proud, because I knew it was for love, not luxury. I've never been a woman of luxury, but of dreams, yes. And that dream had a name, seeing my son happy. The neighbors called me stingy. They said I seemed to hoard money even in the bottom of the rice cooker. And maybe they were right. But what they didn't know is that every scraped-out pot hid a hope. The hope of seeing my boy smile on a day that would be his alone. That was enough for me. Or, at least, I thought it was. Sometimes I'd find myself flipping through bridal magazines on the bus, tired on my way home from work. Not for myself, of course, but to imagine what his day would be like. The white dress, the entrance music, the guests applauding. I'd allow myself to dream silently, without anyone noticing. Dreaming cost nothing, but it nourished me like a banquet. When life seemed too hard, I'd look at the empty bed in his room. That bed held so many stories, sleepless nights with fever, days of trials, muffled cries. And I'd tell myself, it'll all be worth it. One day, you'll give him the party he deserves. It was my way of not giving up on myself. I collected each coin like someone collecting love letters. They weren't numbers in the bank. They were memories wrapped in sweat and patience. I wasn't buying luxury. I was buying the future. Or, at least, that was the illusion that lulled me to sleep every night. The wedding was the translation of my love into tangible details. Flowers, music, lights. Everything had a flavor of renunciation, of waiting. I didn't see luxury in every expense. I saw pieces of myself scattered throughout the hall. It was my heart transformed into decoration. And today, when I look back, I realize maybe I confused love with material proof. Maybe I believed too much that money could be synonymous with gratitude. But back then, I didn't see that. I only saw the brightness of the future and the certainty that I was doing the right thing. Was I really? The sun rose lazily that morning, but to me it felt like the whole sky was celebrating. I woke early, even before the alarm clock, my heart pounding as if it wanted to leap out of my chest. I ran my hands over my face and took a deep breath. It was the day I'd saved every penny for, every silently swallowed tear, every sleepless night. My son's wedding. I put on my best outfit, the one I'd bought just for the occasion, even though it was plain compared to the other women I knew would be there. But it didn't matter, because I wasn't going to be seen but to see, to witness my boy begin a new life. As I fixed my hair in front of the mirror, I felt a mixture of pride and fear. Pride for everything I'd built, fear of losing the place I'd always held in his life. When I arrived at the dining room, the lights were already on, illuminating every detail I had so carefully chosen. The white flowers, the neatly lined chairs, the sweet smell of food wafting from the kitchen. It was as if every sacrifice in my life had materialized into beauty in that space. For a moment, my eyes welled up. I thought it was worth it. The guests arrived, one by one, and I felt like I owned every smile, every compliment. When I heard someone say, "What a beautiful party," my heart swelled as if it were me. Because deep down it was. I had built that day with my own hands, even if no one knew it. Then the music started. And when I saw my son, in a suit, walking down the aisle, I felt a strange pang. It wasn't just joy. It was as if a door inside me was slowly closing. The boy I'd cradled in my arms was no more. Before me stood a man who now belonged to another life. And I wondered, was there still room for me in this new story? The bride appeared soon after, radiant, with a smile that seemed to stretch across her face. Everyone applauded, but I remained silent, simply watching. She was beautiful, perfect, as if she'd stepped out of the pages of those magazines I read on the bus. And I thought, now, it's with her that he'll share the dreams he once shared with me. During the ceremony, as the priest spoke of unity, love, and fidelity, I couldn't stop looking at my son's face. He looked happy, and that should have been enough for me. But something deep inside me whispered uneasily, as if a shadow already loomed over that moment of light. I couldn't understand why. The party began soon after, with loud music and laughter echoing through the room. I tried to blend in, smile, dance a little, but the feeling that I was just a spectator grew within me. As if everyone was celebrating a victory I wasn't a part of. Still, I forced myself to toast. I raised my glass and said silently, "Be happy, my son, even if it costs me my happiness." Every detail seemed perfect, but deep inside me there was a discomfort I didn't want to admit, an emptiness that hid behind the smiles. I wondered if it was just a mother's jealousy, or if it was a warning I wasn't ready to hear. Life always gives us signs, but we don't always have the courage to see them. As the evening drew to a close and the last guests began to say their goodbyes, I stood there, watching the hall empty. The flowers no longer held their freshness, the music sounded tired, and I, inside, was silent. I knew it was both an end and a beginning. I just didn't imagine that, from then on, the price of my love would be exacted in ways I could never have foreseen. The days after the wedding should have been filled with joy, but something inside me couldn't find rest. I'd return home and feel a strange, heavy silence, as if a breath of air was missing. It was strange. I'd achieved my greatest dream, but my heart felt empty. Maybe it was just longing, I kept telling myself, trying to convince myself. My son hardly ever called me. Before, even when he was tired, he'd stop by to have dinner with me, share some news, or ask for advice. Now, The hours stretched by in silence, and when the phone rang, it wasn't his voice anymore. It was the answering machine, cold, cutting off any hope. I smiled to hide it, but inside, my chest tightened. The first time I visited them in their new home, I noticed some strange looks. The bride greeted me with a polite but distant smile, like someone opening the door out of obligation. I brought a cake, the kind my son always loved, but he only tasted a slice, as if it no longer tasted the same. Then I realized something was changing. At family gatherings, I noticed her name was the center of attention. Everyone praised her elegance, her politeness, her manners. I, who had always been simple, felt diminished, as if there was no longer a place for me at that table. It was as if the love I had given in silence was invisible. One Sunday, when I called to invite them to lunch, I heard my son say, "Mom, I can't make it today. She doesn't like heavy food." The phrase pierced me like a knife. Since when was my food heavy? Since when did the home where he grew up go from being cozy to becoming a burden? I began to notice small gestures. When I spoke, she would discreetly roll her eyes. When I recalled stories from the past, he would change the subject. I, who had once been her safe haven, now seemed like an inconvenient visitor. It hurt to realize this, but I didn't want to believe it. At night, alone, I would go over every detail. Had I made a mistake by giving too much? Had I accustomed my son to receiving without teaching him the true value of sacrifice? The questions gnawed at me, but there was no answer. Only a silence that followed me like a faithful shadow. My friends tried to console me, telling me it was normal, that marriage changes everything. But deep down I knew it wasn't just change, it was distance. A distance that grew larger every day and that I couldn't stop. It was like watching a boat pull away from the dock while my hands waved uselessly. Deep down, I sensed that those small shadows were just the beginning, and that something much bigger was coming. A whirlwind I could never have imagined that would forever change the course of my life. It was Mother's Day when everything began to take on a different meaning. I woke up early, lovingly set the table, placed fresh flowers in the vase, and anxiously waited for my son. Deep down, I knew he might not come, but a mother's heart is stubborn. It insists on waiting until the last moment. When the doorbell rang, my chest filled with relief. He was there, accompanied by his wife, holding a small, elegant package. His smile was restrained, almost rehearsed, and without thinking, I rushed to hug him. But I realized the hug no longer held the same firmness as before, as if it were merely formal. I sat before the gift, unwrapping it with trembling hands. Inside the box was a pair of simple, cheap plastic flip-flops. I stared at it, trying to hide the pain that coursed through me. It was as if every sacrifice I'd made had been reduced to 20 reis. My heart screamed, but my mouth remained silent. I remembered when he was little and would give me flowers picked from the garden. Back then, there was no money, but there was love. And now, faced with that meaningless gift, I realized that time had taken away more than I was willing to admit. What lay before me wasn't about material value, but about what no longer existed between us. His wife, noticing my silence, commented with a cold smile, "He chose it." The phrase sounded like a sentence. It wasn't about the present, it was about the distance, the lack of care, the forgetfulness. I held back tears, feigning joy, because a mother always tries to protect her child, even from herself. At that moment, I felt something inside me break. Not because of the slipper itself, but because of what it represented. Indifference. The same indifference I'd already felt in the hurried visits, the rarefied connections, the averted glances. The present merely gave form to what the silence already screamed. At night, lying alone, I held that slipper in my hands and cried softly. I cried for all the sleepless nights I'd spent trying to give him the best. I cried for the clothes I'd neglected to buy for myself, for the dreams I'd postponed, for the pain I'd hidden. Everything seemed to have turned to cheap rubber. The worst part of all was knowing there was no going back. The bond was no longer the same. I was no longer the priority, nor the warm memory. I had become just the mother, that figure who sits in the corner, remembered out of obligation on dates marked on the calendar. At that moment, I realized the gift wasn't just an object, but an omen, a warning that something much more painful was coming. And deep down, I already knew, the wounds were just beginning to open. After that Mother's Day, I realized my relationship with my son would never be the same. Visits became increasingly rare, and when they did happen, they were rushed, as if there was always something more important to do. I'd wait for hours, preparing his favorite meal, only to hear "I can't stay long." The calls changed, too. Before, he'd tell me details about his work, laugh at my stories, and ask for advice on even the smallest things. Now, his voice sounded distant, formal, almost strange. Often, it was his wife who answered, always saying, "He's busy, he'll call back later." But that call never came. The worst part was feeling the distance in his subtle gestures. When we saw each other, he no longer hugged me like he used to. There was no longer that look of complicity, that silent affection that only a mother and son understand. I felt like a stranger, someone who had to ask permission to exist by his side. Family gatherings became a stage for embarrassment. I noticed how far he sat from me, as if the mere touch would make him uncomfortable. And his daughter-in-law, always elegant, made a point of taking up every inch of space, as if trying to erase me from his memory. I smiled to hide it, but inside, the pain throbbed. Sometimes I wondered if it was all my fault. Had I demanded too much? Had I, by spending my savings on the wedding, created an invisible debt he never wanted to assume? These questions haunted me, like ghosts that haunt the mind when the house is already silent. I began to feel the weight of loneliness in a different way. It wasn't just being alone, but feeling forgotten. Walking around the house and seeing the portraits on the walls, smiling, while the present became increasingly empty. It was as if I'd lost a piece of myself, but no one noticed. My friends tried to console me, saying that time heals, that children always come back. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a phase. It was a choice. My son was choosing to walk away, and I was powerless in the face of it. A mother can teach so many things, but she can never force her child to love back. At night, I cried in secret, afraid that even my tears would turn to shame. After all, who could understand a mother who gave everything and received so little? Who could feel the emptiness of watching one's own child become a stranger? The separation was like a silent disease, one that starts slowly but eats away at you until nothing remains but pain. And I already knew. The worst was yet to come. I was already accustomed to the silence that surrounded my life when one day, the unexpected knocked on my door. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those where loneliness weighs more heavily than the body itself. I heard a quick, impatient knock, and when I opened the door, I saw my daughter-in-law standing there, serious, with her arms crossed and a look that seemed to pierce my soul. Without hesitation, she entered the house as if it were her own. She placed a folder on the table and said dryly, "We need to talk." My heart raced. I knew nothing good would come of this. I sat down slowly, trying to remain calm as she spread the papers before me. It was a contract, something related to my savings that I never imagined had come into her hands. She spoke quickly, using difficult words, but what I understood was enough to chill my blood. The money I had saved, the one left over from a lifetime of sacrifice, was at stake. Somehow, my son had put my name to commitments I hadn't known about, and now they were holding me accountable. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. The same son I'd worked day and night for, the one I'd saved every penny to give him a worthy marriage, was now using my sweat for interests I didn't even know what they were. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, but my daughter-in-law's firm gaze said otherwise. It was confirmation that I no longer had control over anything. My body trembled. My hands sweated, and I tried in vain to find the strength to react. I asked where my son was, why he wasn't there. She simply replied coldly, "He thought it best for me to come. He doesn't like seeing you nervous." Those words fell like stones. He didn't have the courage to look me in the eye. The pain wasn't just about the money. It was about the silent betrayal, about the choice to walk away even in difficult times. I, who had always been there, was now discarded, as if my role had run out along with the bills I kept in the drawer. I was in shock, speechless. I just nodded, as if accepting the sentence. She took the papers, stood, and left, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in the air, the scent of victory, perhaps. I remained seated, alone, trying to understand when my life had turned upside down. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, remembering every sacrifice I'd made, every penny I'd saved. Now everything seemed to slip through my fingers, not just the money, but also the love, the trust, the connection I'd believed would last forever. It was the beginning of a painful truth. My son was no longer the boy I'd raised. He had become someone I no longer recognized. And this shock was the trigger for a whirlwind that was yet to come. The following days were filled with suffocating anguish. I could barely look in the mirror without asking myself, where did I go wrong? But, as they say, the truth always finds a way to reveal itself, and when it did, it hurt more than any physical blow could have. One afternoon, a neighbor approached me. She seemed hesitant, like someone carrying a secret too heavy to bear. She sat with me in the kitchen and, between sips of coffee, blurted out what I feared most. My son and his wife lived on appearances. The expensive clothes, the lavish dinners, the trips they flaunted in photos, everything was supported by debts, loans, and favors. Every detail was like a knife in my chest. I, who had always taught him the value of living simply, now saw that I was trapped in a world of vanity and illusions. And worst of all, part of this sandcastle was built on what had once been my sweat. They used my name, my trust as bargaining chips. I spent sleepless nights remembering the neighbor's words, connecting the pieces of the puzzle. The cold visits, the sidelong glances, the cheap flip-flops, the icy conversation about my savings, it all made sense now. It wasn't an attention or a natural change in marriage, it was calculation. Every gesture, every distance, hid a greater purpose. One day, I decided to go over to their house. I walked in unannounced as I used to, and there they were, welcoming friends, laughing loudly, showing off things I knew they couldn't afford. My son, upon seeing me, froze. My daughter-in-law, however, didn't hide her discomfort. It was as if my presence ruined the perfect scene she was putting on for the others. I sat, watching in silence. Their every word seemed rehearsed, like actors in a play. I realized then that my son was no longer just a victim of her influence. He, too, had chosen to wear that mask. Perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of ambition. But deep down, it was his choice. The cruelest thing was realizing that the truth hurt not only because of what I discovered, but because of what I lost. I wasn't facing a couple in trouble, but two people coming together to maintain a charade, and I was just an inconvenient obstacle. In that instant, I understood. The separation hadn't been a coincidence, nor the careless gift, nor the coldness of the words. It was all part of a calculated process to push me aside, to weaken my defenses until I no longer had a voice. I returned home with my heart in pieces, carrying the certainty that the truth hidden behind masks is always crueler than any explicit lie. And something told me there was still more to discover, secrets that could destroy what little peace I had left. The following days were like an open wound that never healed. Every memory of the sacrifices I'd made to raise my son came back like a cruel movie, contrasting with his indifference now. It was as if a mother's love had become worthless currency. And I began to understand how ingratitude exacts a heavy price, not in money, but in the soul of the bearer. He remembered the sleepless nights in the hospital, the double shifts, the exhausted body, and the hopeful heart. All so he could have a better life, so he wouldn't want for anything. And now, every effort seemed thrown to the wind, replaced by the false shine of appearances. What hurts isn't the expense, but realizing that none of it was remembered. The price of ingratitude isn't just the emptiness it leaves in the heart of the giver. It's also the silent corrosion in those who practice it. I knew, deep down, that my son wasn't at peace. No man can betray his own roots and live in peace. But the difference is that his wound was hidden, while mine bled in the open. I also realized how ingratitude drives people apart, creates chasms. It not only destroys trust, but also kills the hope of closeness. I began to feel like someone banished from my own family, an outsider within the story I myself helped build. It was as if my role had ended, and I had been discarded without warning. In conversations with friends, many would tell me, "You're still a mother, the blood calls, it will return." But I knew that ingratitude is treacherous. It intoxicates the person who practices it, like a sweet poison that pushes them further and further away from the path back. Maybe one day they'll realize it, but maybe it'll be too late. The hardest part was understanding that ingratitude exacts invisible tolls. It destroys not only bonds, but also memories. Little by little, even the good times we had were tainted by this bitter feeling. Looking at an old photo no longer brought just joy, but the painful reminder of how everything had changed. Even so, within me, there was a constant struggle. Part of me wanted to believe that my son still remembered who I was, still carried within him gratitude for the years we spent together. Another, more wounded part told me he had already crossed a line of no return. At night, I reflected on how a mother's love never demands return, but expects respect. And when even that's lacking, ingratitude becomes a knife, cutting deep. I knew I was paying a high price, but I also sensed that sooner or later, the bill would come due. The price of ingratitude is this: it leaves empty hearts, silent homes, and shattered memories. And I feared this debt would still extend far beyond what I could bear. If there was anything that tortured me most, it wasn't the harsh words or the cold gestures. It was the silence, the absence of any sign, as if I'd disappeared from his life. The phone no longer rang, the messages I sent went unanswered, and special dates passed unnoticed, as if they meant nothing. This silence weighed more heavily than any explicit offense. It was strange. I was surrounded by noisy memories, his laughter as a child, his crying in the wee hours of the morning, the lively conversations that filled the house. Now, that same house felt like a desert, where even the clock insisted on echoing every second, reminding me I was alone. Silence had become a cruel companion. I realized that silence is also a form of punishment. There was no need for shouting or arguing. This absence alone was enough to make me feel small, irrelevant, forgotten. I wondered, did my son realize how much this emptiness hurt? Or was that precisely the point? Every time I tried to get closer, I was met with closed doors. When I called, my daughter-in-law would answer and make excuses. When she showed up, there was always a rush, commitments, and excuses. Little by little, I began to understand that the silence wasn't carelessness, but choice. And this realization ate away at me. On sleepless nights, I reflected on the destructive power of silence. It leaves no visible marks, but corrodes the soul like rust. There's no defense against it because there's nothing to hold on to. It's like fighting the wind. You get tired, worn out, but never win. I no longer knew what was worse, his absence or his cold presence. Perhaps the silence was even crueler because it made me imagine 1,000 things. What did he think of me? Did he speak ill of me to others? Did he see me as a burden? The questions echoed unanswered, and this uncertainty was devastating. Silence also forced me to face loneliness head-on. I discovered that it's not noise that fills life, but the bonds we create. And when those bonds are broken, everything loses color. The food tastes tasteless, the house lacks warmth, the days have no meaning. It's like living in a faded photograph. But at the same time, there was something revealing about this silence. It showed me truths I might not have dared to see. It showed that my son no longer saw me as a priority, that the love I gave no longer found room in his heart. And this truth, painful as it was impossible to deny. The weight of silence lies not only in the absence of words, but in what it screams without saying. And what it told me, without a single lyric, was that I was no longer part of the life I helped build. There are pains that time doesn't take away. On the contrary, the more the days pass, the deeper they seem to grow, like a blade that insists on cutting the same place. That was the wound inside me. No ointment, no prayer, no advice from a friend could heal it. It was a silent but constant pain that accompanied me every step of the way. I tried to move on with my life, occupying my mind with small tasks, but all it took was a single detail, an old photograph, a song he liked, even the smell of fresh coffee, for everything to come flooding back. It was as if the universe conspired to remind me, every day, of the void my own son left. People said, "Time heals all." But I knew that wasn't true. This wound wouldn't heal because it wasn't my fault, but his. It was a gash left open by absence, by ingratitude, by the silence that stretched like an abyss between us. I could try to mend my heart, but every time I remembered all I'd done for him, the tissue tore again. I began to realize that the wound wasn't just the distance, but the contrast between who I was to him and who he had become to me. I'd given everything I had, my time, my youth, my health, and in return I received indifference. This imbalance hurt more than any words. It was the cruel mathematics of life. I gave 100 and received almost nothing. Sometimes I found myself wondering what it would be like if he one day knocked on my door, hugged me tightly, and said, "Mom, forgive me." Would that be enough? Would an apology heal this wound? I had no answer. I only knew that forgiveness must be sincere, and I feared he'd already forgotten even what he was supposed to apologize for. The wound also made me harder. I became suspicious of people, became more silent, and kept my pain bottled up inside. I was no longer the same joyful woman who believed in happy endings. I had a tired look in my eyes, marked by disappointment, and this weight was visible even to those I passed on the street. But deep down I knew the wound persisted because there was too much love involved. If it were hate, perhaps it would be easier to forget. But love, when hurt, leaves scars that never disappear. And that's the contradiction that hurts the most. Loving someone who causes us pain. I kept living, it's true. Breathing, walking, getting through each day. But inside me, that open wound continued to throb, reminding me that life doesn't always reward us for the love we give. Sometimes, it only leaves us with invisible scars, impossible to explain to those who haven't experienced it. And so, each morning was another day of struggle, fighting not to cry, fighting not to give up, fighting not to let the wound consume me completely. But deep down I knew this pain still had so much more to show me. I hadn't expected to see him so soon. After months of silence, a brief phone call changed the course of my week. He said he'd be home, without explanation. My heart raced, torn between hope and fear. Was he coming to reconcile? Or would he bring more pain? On the appointed day, I set the table like old times, with fresh coffee, a simple cake, and a clean tablecloth. It was an automatic, almost instinctive gesture, as if my mother's heart still believed that a loving gesture could mend the broken threads. But deep down, I already suspected that this reunion wouldn't be a sweet one. When the door opened, I didn't see the son I'd raised, but a hard-faced man, accompanied by his wife. He entered without hugs, without smiles. The air was heavy, as if an invisible court had been installed inside my room. I knew immediately. They hadn't come for me, but for something I had. The words were direct, cold. He spoke of inheritance, documents, rights. There was no emotion, only demands. Each sentence was a hammer blow to my chest. I looked at him, trying to find a trace of that boy who held my hand on the street, but I only saw someone distant, almost unrecognizable. The cake remained untouched, the coffee cooled in the pot. The daughter-in-law, impatient, shot looks as if to say, "Sign quickly." Sitting across from them, I felt the ground give way. It wasn't just a negotiation. It was the realization that affection had been replaced by self-interest. At times, he avoided my gaze. And that hurt even more because it showed that, deep down, he still knew what he was doing. But I didn't have the courage to face the truth. The silence between one sentence and the next screamed louder than any words. I took a deep breath and didn't sign anything. I simply said, "What's mine won't be conquered by pressure. And what's yours, you already lost when you stopped being my son." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. They stood up, visibly irritated, and left, slamming the door. I was left alone in the room, staring at the cold coffee and the untouched cake. And I understood that this reunion didn't bring solace, but rather the bitter confirmation that the distance between us wasn't an accident. It was a choice. It was at that moment that I realized, sometimes, the reunion we so long for only serves to show us that certain wounds are deeper than we imagine. After that bitter visit, the house never seemed the same. The walls seemed colder, the silence heavier, and even the clock ticked with a cruel slowness. The home that had once brimmed with life was now just a space where memories echoed, memories that hurt more than they comforted. I began to wander through the rooms as if I were wandering through a museum of memories. Every object had a story. The couch where he slept after school, the table where we ate meals, the window through which I watched him play in the backyard. Everything remained in the same place, but there was no one else to give it meaning. The emptiness wasn't just physical, it was emotional. His absence multiplied in every corner, making the space too large for one person. At night, when I lay down to bed, the silence of the house seemed to scream, reminding me that I was alone. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no voice calling Mom. There was only the distant sound of my own breathing. Some days, I tried to fill the void with visits from distant friends or relatives. They would come, chat, laugh a little, but when they left, the loneliness returned even stronger. It was like trying to fill a deep hole with a handful of sand. Futile. The empty house also forced me to face truths I'd avoided. It wasn't just the distance from my son that weighed on me, but the realization that aging is, in many ways, a process of loss. We lose people, we lose spaces, we even lose ourselves little by little. There were days when I'd walk to the door, hoping to hear the doorbell ring, but nothing happened. The street went on as usual. Neighbors passed by, children played, but my door remained closed, as if fate had forgotten it. It was then that I realized the house wasn't just empty of people, but of purpose. It was no longer a home. It was a repository of memories of a time that would never return. And living among these memories was like living with ghosts. They were there, but they didn't embrace me. I knew I needed to learn to deal with this emptiness, but each day it felt like it reinvented itself, showing me new forms of loneliness. The echo of my own footsteps down the hallway was the cruelest reminder of all. I was the sole inhabitant of a space that was once filled with love. And deep down, that empty house was the exact portrait of what my heart had become. For a long time, I still harbored a spark of hope. Even after the disappointments, I harbored the illusion that one day he would return, perhaps regretful, perhaps more mature, but he would return. This flame, small and fragile, was what kept me going through the darkest days. But even hope, when unrequited, eventually shatters. I remember one night in particular when I dreamed he knocked on my door with a shy smile, carrying flowers in his hands. I woke with tears in my eyes and ran to the window, almost believing I would find the scene before me. But the street was empty, only the wind swaying the trees. It was at that moment that I felt a snap inside me. Hope was nothing more than an insistent dream. I began to realize that every gesture I made, preparing a dish he liked, keeping the room tidy as if he would show up, even turning on the porch light at night, were nothing more than desperate attempts to keep that expectation alive. I fooled myself, pretending the future still held a reunion. Little by little, reality set in. Time passed, the years piled up, and he never returned. Special dates that could have been bridges became chasms. Forgotten birthdays, Christmases without messages, Mother's Days in absolute silence. Each absence was like a hammer shattering what remained of my faith. I even began to think that perhaps hope was actually a form of torture, because the more I believed, the more I suffered. With each day without news, it was as if a part of me was dying again. It was a slow, invisible death, one that no one around me could perceive. One day, standing in the mirror, I saw in my own eyes the reflection of this brokenness. There was no longer the brightness of someone who hopes, but the weariness of someone who has given up. The hope that had always guided me like a lantern in the dark was gone forever. And with it, an essential part of me was gone too. The cruelest thing is that it wasn't a sudden break, but a gradual one. Like a glass that slowly cracks, until one day it can't take it anymore and shatters into 1,000 pieces. And when I realized it, there was no way to put anything back together. Only fragments scattered inside my chest remained. Losing a child to death is terrible, but losing one to ingratitude is even worse. Because death isn't something you choose, but indifference is. And accepting that he chose to forget me was the hardest blow life could ever deal me. The broken hope left an irreversible void. And with it, I learned that not all stories can be fixed, and not all loves find an answer. I always knew there was something hidden behind my son's withdrawal. His coldness couldn't have come out of nowhere, not after so many years of dedication. Until, one silent afternoon, the truth knocked on my door in the cruelest way possible. It was a neighbor, one of those who sees what's happening without being noticed, who brought me the first clues. With a hesitant look, she told me she'd seen my daughter-in-law in heated conversations with strangers, strange people hanging around their house, papers being hurriedly signed. My heart raced. Something didn't smell right. At first, I tried to dismiss my suspicions, thinking it was just gossip. But inside me, intuition burned like a coal. I decided to investigate discreetly. That's how I discovered that the family name was mired in debt, risky business dealings, and even fraud. My son, who once dreamed so much, was now a prisoner of bad choices. The most painful part was realizing it wasn't just his weakness. It was manipulation. The woman he'd chosen as his partner had entangled him in a web of self-interest, keeping him away from me so there would be no witnesses or moral restraints. The indifference I felt wasn't just his, it was orchestrated. As the pieces began to fall into place, I felt a lump in my throat. It was as if all the rejection, all the distance, had been carefully planned to silence me, so I wouldn't find out what was really going on. My motherly love had become a threat to her plans. The revealed truth was a shock, but also a kind of relief. It wasn't just that he'd stopped loving me, but that he was lost in an emotional and financial trap. Still, the pain didn't lessen, because after all, he'd allowed it. I looked back and understood every strange attitude, every cold response, every absence. None of it had been a coincidence. It was the result of a poisonous influence he hadn't been able to resist. And realizing this made my wound burn even more. I had raised him to be strong, but he had become too fragile in the face of the world. That night, I sat alone and cried like I hadn't cried in a long time. Not for what I'd lost, but for what he'd become. It was as if the son I'd known had died, leaving only a manipulated shadow in his place. The truth was finally before me, but along with it came the question that would haunt me from then on. What would I do with this revelation? After discovering the full truth, I realized I could no longer remain silent. The silence had eaten away at me for too long. If I continued to pretend I didn't see, I would be signing my own sentence of invisibility. The time had come for confrontation, however painful it might be. I chose a Sunday, a day I knew they would be home. I walked there with firm steps, but my heart was racing. Each beat seemed to echo inside my chest like a war drum. I carried nothing but my voice and the courage I had struggled to summon. When the door opened, I saw my son, surprised and uncomfortable. My daughter-in-law, in the background, gave me a cold smile, as if she already knew the reason for my visit. I walked in without waiting for an invitation, looked him in the eye, and said, "We need to talk, now." My tone left no room for escape. We sat at the table. The atmosphere was charged. I didn't beat around the bush. I spoke of the debts, the forged documents, the rumors that were no longer just rumors. He tried to deny it, stammered, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. With each word I spoke, his face changed color, now red with anger, now pale with shame. My daughter-in-law tried to intervene, claiming I didn't understand, that I was overreacting. But I looked her in the eye and said firmly, "You can fool a lot of people, but not a mother." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, even the air seemed to stop. My son lowered his head. I saw there the boy I'd raised, hidden beneath layers of weakness and manipulation. He didn't have the courage to contradict me because he knew I'd found out. But he also didn't have the strength to defend me. This omission hurt more than any insult. I stood up and said, tears in my eyes, "I will not allow them to use my name or my life to support lies. If you choose this path, choose to live without me." He remained silent, unmoving, while his irritated daughter-in-law held his arm like a hostage. I left that house with my soul in pieces. There were no shouts, no reconciliation. Only the bitter realization that confrontation was necessary, but it didn't guarantee victory. I had done my part. The rest was up to him. Out on the street, the wind blew against my face, bringing a strange sense of freedom mixed with grief. The confrontation had freed me from the weight of silence, but condemned me to carry a new pain, that of perhaps never having my son back. It didn't take long for the whole family to learn of the confrontation. As always, word spread faster than the courts. Soon, I was the villain of the story, painted as the bitter mother who couldn't accept her son's happiness. It was curious how no one bothered to hear my side, just repeating what suited them. The calls started out cold. Some nephews asked me if it was true that I was causing trouble over money. Others insinuated that I was jealous of my daughter-in-law, as if a mother's love were comparable to petty squabbling. It was like being tried in a silent courtroom with no right to a defense. At family gatherings, the weight was even greater. Looks pierced like knives, conversations stopped when I arrived, and even hugs seemed forced. With every gesture, I felt the verdict had already been passed. I had been condemned to isolation. The cruelest thing was realizing that my son, silent, allowed her version of events to prevail. He didn't defend me, didn't justify me, just watched in silence, allowing their image of me to be distorted. This silence of his, once again, hurt more than any words spoken against me. There was a lunch where the humiliation was explicit. My daughter-in-law, with that air of false innocence, commented loudly that I always wanted to control other people's lives. Laughter erupted around the table, and my son, instead of objecting, simply lowered his head as if in agreement. At that moment, I understood that there was no longer room for me in that circle. I felt like an outsider within my own family. The blood that bound us was no longer enough to maintain ties, and I could tell everyone was more concerned with not alienating them than with seeking the truth. Justice in this trial had no place. The weight of this public judgment eroded my strength. I had always believed that family was a shelter, but it had become a battlefield, where I was the only sworn enemy. It was an emotional lynching, disguised as coexistence. And so, surrounded by relatives, I had never felt so alone. It was like being in the center of a crowd that pointed fingers, but no look conveyed compassion. I, who had so often welcomed others, was now symbolically expelled from the very nest I had helped build. That day, when I returned home, I understood. It wasn't just my son I had lost. It was the recognition of the entire family who chose to believe lies because it was easier than facing the truth. And the worst part is that, inside me, the question that haunted me relentlessly remained: would they ever regret this unfair judgment? When the family's voices fell silent and the noise of accusations faded, what remained was a heavy silence. Loneliness seeped through the cracks of the house and filled every corner with its suffocating presence. There were no more phone calls, no more visits, no more invitations to meetings. I had become a forgotten name. The mornings were the cruelest. The sun rose outside, but inside me a thick shadow reigned. The coffee on the table seemed too bitter when there was no one to share it with. Even the furniture, which had once held happy memories, now seemed to mock the emptiness. The weight of absence was almost physical, like a stone on my chest. Sometimes I'd find myself talking to myself, just to hear a sound other than the ticking of the clock. I'd read old letters, relive yellowed photos, and each memory pulled me deeper into a silent abyss. Loneliness wasn't just a lack of company, it was the feeling of being invisible, of no longer having a place in the world. On Sundays, when the silence of the street was cut by the laughter of neighboring families gathered together, I felt a knife twist in my soul. It was impossible not to wonder, how can a mother be forgotten by her own children? How can a family turn their backs on someone who gave everything? Over time, loneliness stopped being just pain. It became a kind of prison. The days dragged on, repetitive, without perspective. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. The woman there had a lined face, tired eyes, and a soul that carried not only the years, but also rejection. I learned that loneliness weighs more heavily when it's not chosen. Being alone by choice can be peaceful. Being alone because you've been abandoned is a condemnation. And this condemnation was my daily cross. But paradoxically, it was in this cruel silence that I began to listen more deeply. Between tears and sighs, I realized there was a voice within me that still insisted on resisting, a flame that, though weak, would not be extinguished. Loneliness, with all its weight, also revealed who I was without others. Still, the pain was constant. Each night, as I lay down to bed, the question returned: would my son ever remember I existed? Or would my story end like this, erased by the oblivion of those I loved most? Over time, I realized I needed to put into words everything that burned inside me. Loneliness pushed me toward silence, but my heart demanded writing. It was then that I began writing my own will, not of possessions, because those no longer meant anything, but of feelings, memories, and truths that no one wanted to hear. I grabbed an old notebook, its cover worn, and poured my pain into it like someone bleeding on paper. Each sentence was an open wound, each word a scar. I wrote about the sleepless nights, the humiliations, the contempt and ingratitude. I wrote so that, one day, if someone had the courage to read it, they would understand that I wasn't the villain of the story. There was no inheritance of gold, no houses, no riches to share. What I had to leave behind was my raw truth, my version stifled by years of silence. I wrote for my son, even though I knew he might never read it. I wrote for myself, so as not to go mad with so many memories weighing on my chest. As I wrote, I cried. But I realized those tears were no longer tears of weakness. They were tears of liberation. I was finally lifting the weight that had been crushing me. This testament of pain was also an act of courage, a cry against the injustice they had tried to impose on me. I put the notebook away in a drawer, not to be forgotten, but to wait for the right time. Perhaps one day someone would find it and see there not only the pain of a rejected mother, but also the strength of a woman who, even crushed by life, never stopped loving. As I wrote, I realized there is no greater pain than being forgotten by the living. Death, at least, brings rest. Abandonment does not. The will I left was proof of this, a record of how I lived, suffered, and fought, even when I was pushed into oblivion. And, deep down, I also left a hope hidden between the lines, that my son, one day, would stumble upon these words and understand that the greatest inheritance he ever had was myself, with all the sacrifices, with all the love that never failed him. As I closed the notebook, I felt something inside me close as well. Not the wound, that would never heal, but the need to prove who I was. My will was not for heirs of property, but for heirs of truth. And in the silence of the night, as I put away the notebook, I felt that I had fulfilled at least one last duty, to record that a mother's love can be rejected, humiliated, and even betrayed, but never erased. With the notebook tucked away in the drawer, I realized that memories began to visit me more strongly. It was as if each written word had opened a door to the past. And suddenly, old scenes echoed within me again, bringing both comfort and pain. I remembered my little son, running around the house barefoot, laughing with that innocence only children possess. I recalled the days when I sacrificed myself, working endless hours, just to ensure he had a better future. Those moments echoed in my mind like old songs that won't leave my head. But along with the tenderness came ghosts. The echo of the past also brought arguments, tears hidden in the pillow, the first sign of distance between us. Memories that had once been buried now screamed within me, asking, at what point exactly did I lose my son? At night, the silence of the house amplified this echo even more. I heard laughter that was no longer there, smelled the food I'd prepared in happier times, and even the furniture seemed to harbor voices that were no longer there. The past had become a constant and painful presence. It was in this echo that I realized, time doesn't erase, it only transforms into sonorous scars within the soul. What I experienced would never disappear, it would remain there, repeating itself in my memory, like an insistent reminder that wouldn't let me rest. And as much as it hurt, there was also something beautiful in that echo. It was proof that I had truly loved, that my life had not been empty. Even though I was alone today, the past reminded me that, once upon a time, I had been essential to someone. Sometimes I wondered if this echo also reached him. Did my son, in some silent moment, remember me fondly? Or had he buried everything so deep that not even his memory could retrieve it? The echo of the past, though cruel, was also what kept me going, because without it, I might have already surrendered to the darkness of solitude. But as long as those ancient voices resonated, I knew there was still something alive within me. And so, between sweet and painful memories, I continued, trapped between the yesterday that haunted me and the today that ignored me, waiting to see if the future would have the courage to give me back what I had lost. The day came when I realized there was no more hope to be had. My tired body was showing signs, and my soul, scarred by so many wounds, was asking for rest. It was then that I began to prepare my final goodbye, not as a gesture of rebellion, but as a serene surrender of someone who had already given all they could. I spent days in silence, walking through the house as if saying goodbye to every corner. I touched the walls that had heard my confidences, caressed the furniture that held our stories, and closed my eyes to experience the smells and sounds that had once filled that home. Every detail had become a silent farewell. I wrote a final letter, different from the testament of pain. In it, I left only love, no accusations, no bitter memories. I wanted my last words to be seeds of peace, even if they were never read. I placed the letter inside the same notebook, like a golden clasp amidst tear-stained pages. That night, I sat on the porch, gazing at the starry sky. The cool wind caressed my face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange, almost comforting peace. I thought of the arms that no longer held me, the voices that no longer called to me, and I let a solitary tear fall unabated. There was no more resentment in me, only a profound weariness. The final goodbye wasn't to my son, nor to my family, but to the pain I'd carried up until that point. It was a farewell to the suffering that consumed me, the loneliness that imprisoned me, and the hopes that had been shattered along the way. Before going to bed, I walked to the drawer and caressed the notebook one last time. It was as if my entire life had been condensed there. Love, sacrifice, pain, and courage. I closed it carefully, hoping that one day it would be found and that my voice would echo beyond my absence. In bed, I let sleep gently take me. I didn't fear the darkness, for I knew that on the other side there might be light. And for the first time in years, I fell asleep without waiting for a phone call, without waiting for a visit, without clinging to a return that would never come. The final goodbye had no witnesses, no tears from others, no loud speeches. It was silent, intimate, and true, just as my love has always been. And if one day someone remembers me, let it not be for the pain I carried, but for the love I insisted on giving until the end, even when there was no one left to receive it. Not long after my final goodbye, the silence surrounding my departure was broken by an unexpected whisper. The truth began to emerge, like pent-up water finally finding a way to flow. The notebook I'd left hidden away was found, and within it were engraved all the marks of my soul. At first, there was disbelief. My son, leafing through those pages, tried to deny what he read, like someone rejecting a mirror that shows more than they'd like to see. But as he progressed through the lines filled with pain and love, the weight of reality fell upon his shoulders. For the first time, he heard my voice without interrupting, without judging, without running away. The words I wrote tore away the veil of lies surrounding him. The mask of ingratitude fell, and he had to face his own weakness, the mistakes he'd made, and the manipulation he'd allowed to dominate his life. It was too late to ask for forgiveness while he was still alive, but not too late for the truth to deliver its silent justice. The family, who had so often pointed the finger at me, read those pages and felt the weight of shame. They discovered that I wasn't the bitter woman they'd painted, but a mother who fought to the end with every ounce of love she had within her. The truth, finally, cried out louder than the slander. They say some cried when they read my words. Others, silent, lacked the courage to face their own mistakes. But what matters is that my name was not erased, nor my story buried under injustice. The testament of pain also became a testament of love and truth. And so, even in my absence, I achieved what I so longed for in life, to be heard. My words, kept silent for so long, echoed louder than any accusation, more enduring than any ingratitude. In the end, I discovered that the truth always finds its way. It may be late, it may be cruel, but it never fails to surface. And if my life was marked by rejection, may my memory be remembered as that of someone who never gave up on love, even when love seemed irretrievable. The silence that wounded me in life was the same silence that revealed my voice after death. And, in some mysterious way, I know that every tear I shed became a word, and every word a legacy. Because the greatest wealth I left behind wasn't gold, nor a house, nor jewels. It was the truth, and that no one can ever steal. In the end, it wasn't the words spoken in life that resonated, but the truths written in silence. She proved that time may erase memories, but it never destroys the truth. What about you? Are you listening to the silence of those who have always been by your side, or will you wait until it's too late?